Let's dive in and take a look at some very basic web routes. So we already saw from the look around the directory structure that all of our routes are in routes and web or API if we're building an API. So let's open the web routes file. Let's get rid of this comment just here. And let's go ahead and just delete this basic route here. And we'll just start from scratch and build one out ourselves. Now let's go ahead and use the route facade. Now facade is a concept in Laravel which I won't dive too much into because it's a little bit complex at this stage if you're just working with Laravel. But a route is basically a facade is a kind of wrapper for an underlying class. So when you use these in Laravel, and there are lots of them, you're basically accessing in a convenient way an underlying class. And you can see that this is within the facades directory just here, and that's why. So with that out the way, let's go ahead and create a really basic route. So let's kind of recreate the home page. We're using the get method here because we're responding to a get request. Lots of HTTP verbs. So we have post, for example, if we're posting through to a form. We have things like delete if we're deleting a particular resource, and we have things like patch as well if we're perhaps updating a resource. For now, we'll just focus on get. We will look at post a little bit later when we're submitting a form, but the first argument to this method here is the route that you want to respond to. In this case, this is going to be the home page. Now, there are a couple of ways that you can respond to a route. You can either do this via a controller. You can do this just to a kind of standard class that doesn't extend Laravel's base controller, which we saw over in this directory here, or you can create out a closure. So in this case, we just create an anonymous function, and then when Laravel hits, or when you hit this particular route, we do something inside of here. So let's go ahead and just return a string in here. So let's just say home. You wouldn't normally do this. You would go ahead and utilize views, which we'll take a look at a little bit later. If we give that a refresh though, you can see sure enough, we have home output in here. So like I said, you wouldn't start to build up an HTML structure inside of here. You would utilize views, but for now, we'll just go ahead and return some strings. Now you can create multiple routes, of course. You're going to have lots of different pages within your application. So for example, if you had an about page, you would register a new route in here. Again, this is a get request to the about page, and then you would go ahead and return a view either within here or within a controller. So if we head over to the about page just here, sure enough, we get a different result. Now, at some point in your application, you're going to have lots of routes listed, and you may want to find out a little bit more information about them. And that's where we dive into the artisan console once again. So if we take a look here, we've got this route parent, and under this, we've got route list. Let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. So let's say PHP artisan route list, and you can see sure enough, we get a table here with a list of methods, URIs, names, which we'll take a look at in just a second, actions, and middleware. So within a route, you can define the method, which we've already covered, the URI, which we've already covered as well. So we've registered a / route for the home page, an about route. We can give routes names as well, and that's if we want to reference them when we're potentially redirecting over to them. So for example, if your about page URI is likely to change at some point in the future, you can instead give this a name which always remains the same. So if we name this, we can reference this anywhere in our application, and then if the route name changes, it doesn't matter too much. So if the URI changes, that's going to go ahead and not affect our application. We'll take a little look at that later, but you can see here that the name's been listed. Now the action basically just tells us whether this route links up to a controller or a closure, and in this case, we are linking these up to closures. If you run this later on after you start working with controllers, you'll see these reference the controller name and the method that you're running within that controller as well. Now we also have the middleware section, which tells us which middleware this particular route is using. We'll dive into this later, but at the moment the only middleware that's attached to our / and about pages is the web middleware. We have this API user route, which is where we have this in here, and that uses the API middleware, and again that just uses a closure. This is just an example route that's been provided just to get you up and running. So that's pretty much it for the basics of routes. Most of the time you'll just be creating routes like this, which will link up to controllers, which we'll learn about later. Let's move on and talk about route parameters.